Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to not a Legends of Runeterra video, but instead an Arcane video, because today I'm going to give you my Arcane review in full, and we're going to do this in a way that we're going to just quickly go over like the 3 different acts and sort of, quickly give sort of brief overview of what I thought of them, and then we're going to go character by character and sort of, go through all of the key characters and talk about what I thought about them one by one as well as a whole in the show. If you haven't seen the show, then go and watch it because it's insanely good. Spoiler on my review, I guess. Yes, this is a very good show, and so go and watch it if you haven't. This will contain spoilers, obviously. So just go and watch the show. Like, it's really, really good. So yeah. With that said, let's dive straight in, and we're going to start with just some of the sort of production elements, the animation, the voice acting, the general production of the show. The score, the soundtrack, all of that was just really, 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 really good. Like, it was just a really high quality show. I'm sure that everyone pretty much agrees. There really wasn't much to pick flaws in, maybe the odd moment here and there, but for pretty much the entire show, it's just an insane production elements to it, and the animation in particular, really stood out. But really, everything was really good in production value wise, and the script writing, but not just the script writing, also the script editing, I thought was fantastic. There was never really a dull moment in the show. Characters, are acting with like clear intentions and motivations, and it just overall led to an amazing series. And we're gonna, get into it a bit more now. And so let's start with my review of Act 1. And Act 1 is a literal 10 out of 10. Now, it's pretty rare to get like a 10 out of 10 on anything. But Act 1, I think, is a 10 out of 10. It's probably the best start to any show that I've ever seen. And it's helped in some ways by that, because, when you watch starts of other shows, even really good shows, take like, what people might consider a really good show, like Breaking Bad. If you watch season 1 of Breaking Bad, it's kind of a bit slow. It can kind of take some time for a show to sort of set itself up and, get to know the characters and all of that. Act 1 in Arcane is not slow at all. It's full of action, it's full of pace, it's full of tension, it's full of just amazing world building from the start, and all of the world building is kind of, put into this constant tension and action of things going on, and it's just amazing in every single way. And I think Act 1 was helped in a way by the fact that it was a kind of full, complete story in and of itself. It wasn't necessarily having to set something up right away next, to be the next thing, which we'll talk about in Act 2, because I think that that's something that brings Act 2 maybe down a bit. But Act 1 was just an amazing open to a series, and really just blew me away. And I think a lot of people, when they saw Act 1 when it first came out, were like, oh my god, this is like amazing. And thankfully, as we'll get into now, Act 2 and Act 3, didn't disappoint too much. And Act 2 was still very good. I think it was the weakest of the 3. I'd give it like an 8.5 out of 10. I think, as I mentioned, one of the reasons for that was because, between Act 1 and Act 2, of course, there's a big gap of several years, but Act 2 is directly followed by Act 3, and so Act 2 kind of had to set the scene somewhat for Act 3. So, I think that kind of brings it down a bit, because it did have to set the table a bit. But with that said, there was still plenty of good in Act 2. In fact, there was still mostly very, very good in Act 2 for the most part, I would say. And I really enjoyed Act 2. And actually, when I watched it the second time around, I actually enjoyed Act 2 more than I did the first time around, which I was a bit surprised about, because, I was thinking maybe it was a little slow. But actually, when you watch it the second time around, it's not as slow as I remembered. And it actually was, still really good. And then we come to Act 3, and Act 3, in my opinion, finished the story really well. I know that, maybe not every loose end was tied up. In fact, I would say almost all of the loose ends weren't tied up. Really, there was only the resolution to the main storyline, but I personally was fine with that. I actually think that was a good thing in a way, and that's for a couple of reasons. If you play the games, any of, Legends of Runeterra or League of Legends, you know where the characters are going. The characters in those games, you know where they end up, right? We know what's going to happen to Viktor. Like, we know where Viktor ends up. So to me, it was like, there isn't necessarily a key reason to be like, oh, and by the way, this is what happens to Viktor in the end. Like, if you play the games, for a lot of people who play the games, and they've said that, this was designed primarily for players of those games, we already know where those characters are going and where they're going to end up. So there's no real need to, like, there's no real need to like show us exactly what's going to happen if the story was written mainly for the players of those games. And secondly, this whole series is kind of built around constant tension. That's what keeps it good in a lot of ways, is because it's just constant tension throughout the entire series. And so I thought that somewhat not resolving that tension even at the very end of the show was actually quite a good thing. And I liked that it wasn't like they missed out on a couple loose ends. I think that that's always annoying when you tie up most of the stories, but you miss one for some reason, and that sticks with people, and that's annoying. But when you just resolve one story and leave all the others kind of open, I'm actually kind of completely fine with that. And I honestly wouldn't mind if they even didn't do a season 2 and an act 2, or if they did a season 2 of Arcane, which I know has sort of been confirmed at this point, that they just focused on something else. I honestly wouldn't mind at all. I think I'd probably prefer that because I don't want them to ruin it. I want this story to stay really good, and I just want it to stay good. And if they kept it as it is now, it would stay good forever. Okay, but now let's move on to some of the characters. And the characters in this show are really, really, really well written. Mainly because every character in this show seems to have a kind of gray area. No character is sort of just wholly good or wholly bad. They all are put into tense situations where their decisions have consequences, and they're all gray, as in they all make decisions that you're kind of like, that's probably not the right decision there. And even once you start to figure a character out, the show writers will put something in that goes, no, you don't have these characters figured out. But let's start with Jinx. And Jinx is a different kind of gray to all of the other characters, which was kind of refreshing as well, because of course Jinx is very black and white. All of the other characters kind of exist in this middle gray zone, but Jinx is kind of the opposite, where she averages out as gray, but it's because she's completely black or white depending on kind of her mental state. And just an amazing character. I mean, the crying of the powder in Act 1 is just so well done. Like, an animation of a girl crying, like, it could be very awkward. It could, kind of look bad. There was a lot of room for that to kind of go wrong, but instead, it just is so amazing. Powder in Act 1 is just amazing. Then Jinx in Act 2 and 3 is just amazing as well. The whole character arc and her mental instability and the way they kind of show that is just so well done, and the kind of reasons for that as well. That it's not Clagger, it's the other one. I can't think of his name, but you know who I mean. Just talking at her in the back there, and like the drawings showing her mental state, all just amazingly well thought out and well done. And the fact that she's like the daughter of our protagonist in the first act and then becomes the daughter of our antagonist is like a crazy thing. And that moment when Silco is standing over Powder in Act 1, and she goes up to him and hugs him, and he hugs her back, like that was just such a like, what is going on? Like, that was just such a cool ending, and like so unexpected, because in a lot of other shows, they would have had, depending on what kind of antagonist you want, either they kill a little girl or, they dispose of the little girl, and then she does kind of turn evil. I guess she does become evil in a way, but in a very specific, sympathetic way instead. And that's what's so great, is that, there is no sort of good or bad guys in this necessarily. They're all just kind of acting as people might. They all have their own motivations, and it all leads to it, and Jinx was just very well written as well in that regard. Okay, next up we have Vi and Caitlyn, and I'm going to put these two together, mostly because they spend almost all the second and third act together as well, and these two are probably the closest we get to kind of a wholly good characters in the show. But even with that said, Vi hits Powder and walks away in Act 1, and he doesn't seem to care that much when, Jayce has just killed a boy in front of him. She's like, who cares? It's only one kid. Like, there are moments of still like, whoa, you're meant to be our good guys. Like, what's going on? But, these two characters, again, really, really well written, because I think that these two could have been quite dull if they weren't paired together. Like, these two had the potential of being, kind of, not probably one of the worst parts of the show if they weren't put together, but they were put together, and their chemistry is just amazing and fantastic. And these are the characters that are kind of constantly put in danger as well, and so how they react to that is quite interesting. You know, these characters kind of constantly put in conflict because of their relationship as well. And that was the kind of conflict between them, and not just their relationship. Relationship, Caitlyn and Vi. I'm talking more like, you know, their differences and how different they are, you know, created that conflict. Like when Vi, you know, goes to Caitlyn's room and is like, who the hell lives here? And Caitlyn, like, you know, it just showed that difference between them created that constant tension that I think if they weren't paired together throughout this show, something would have been missing. And then obviously the Jinx and Caitlyn kind of rivalry in Jinx's mind, you know, just added to it as well. Like, it's just, without that, I would have been worried like where these characters went, but because the characters meshed together so well and they intertwined with other storylines so well as well, it was just brilliantly done again. And I'm, you know, this whole interaction between the two characters was just really well done. And as I say, I'm glad that they did it, because I think that this could have gone wrong, you know, with slightly worse writing or whatever. This again could have become a bit like, you know, typical. It could have become very easily quite dull, that they were being constantly put in these situations where they were in trouble. You know, that could have become quite tiresome, but they all kind of were different for one reason or another, and they all were interesting because of their differences. And I really like that. And even when, you know, you thought, oh, they're going to see Jinx, I wonder what's going to happen. You know, no one thought like, oh, I bet those, you know, I don't remember what they're called, the guys on Ekko's dudes, what are they called, the Firelights? You know, I doubt anyone thought, oh, they're gonna show up now. That would be, you know, a logical thing to happen. It's like anytime something happened to them, it was like something else would just happen all of a sudden. It'd be like, well, that kind of makes sense, and you know, here we go. And yeah, just brilliantly done for both those characters. So next up, we come to Jayce, and Jayce is like a fascinating, frustrating character in this show. Like, he's so just frustrating, I say would be the word, but in like a good way, not in kind of like a oh, get off my screen way, in like a kind of good way, in that he's kind of a character that can never do right. He always makes decisions and they're always the wrong ones. Now, Jayce, I should say, this was the only time, and this is why I would mark Act 2 down a bit than the other two acts, is because Jayce is kind of the only character who made a decision that I was kind of like, I'm not sure he would have. Does that really make sense? And that was during the kind of opera thing where he decides to join in with Mel and kind of become corrupt. That seemed to happen like maybe a bit too quickly for me. You know, I think it would have made more sense to have that happen maybe after they had, you know, sort of become a thing, Mel and Jayce. You know, that would have made maybe more sense if it would have happened before, and then he kind of becomes convinced to become corrupt. Whereas it kind of just happened. Mel was just like, "Hey, why don't you become corrupt?" And he was like, "Yeah, okay." You know, that was kind of the only time in the entire show where I was a bit like, I'm not too sure about that. But with that said, Jayce was maybe not the best in Act 2. In Act 3, I loved Jayce, because Jayce just acted like someone who was out of their depth, which he was. You know, he was just thrown in to become a counselor, and he constantly thought he was doing the right thing, but then very quickly would sort of figure out, I'm not doing the right thing. Like, for instance, you know, he votes Heimerdinger off the council, and then later on says, man, why did I vote Heimerdinger off this council? You know, like, every decision he makes, he kind of realizes the consequences of them and feels like he has to go back. But that's what someone who is out of their depth would do. You know, he wasn't, you know, built to become a counselor. You know, he never had any ambition of becoming a counselor. He says that to Mel, you know, I didn't ask to become a counselor. You made me a counselor. And it just fits so well that every decision he made, it just felt like, you know, he wants to go to war all of a sudden, and then he kills a kid, and then it's like, oh, well, we can't go to war because, you know, I've seen what war will do between us, you know, and I don't want that. And it's just, it all made so much sense, all of his decisions in Act 3. Like, even though he constantly kept changing sides and changing his mind in terms of what he wanted to do, it all actually made sense, and it all worked really well, and he was being pulled by all these different characters as to what to do as well, and he was just in the middle of this massive web that he felt like he had no control of. And so it's kind of why he was frustrating, because you kind of wanted to just sort of break through, and we never really got to see that, but it just worked. You know, I kind of like just being there with Jayce, like being frustrated almost for him that he couldn't, like, you know, just sort of break through it all, because of course he just wanted to be a scientist and work on hex tech and just improve lives that way, but instead he just got, you know, wrangled into a world that he never really asked for, and it worked really well. Moving on to Viktor, and I'm sure that Viktor will end up being a lot of people's one of their favorite characters in the show because he's just so likable. He's just such an easy character for root for, and interesting. He's like the complete opposite of Jayce. Jayce is intertwined with all these different storylines, and Jayce is kind of in the middle of everything that has to go on with the show. If something happens in the show, it's like Jayce then has a scene reacting to whatever's happened in the show. Whereas Viktor is like the complete opposite. He's like in his own world. Viktor is like solely focused on one thing, and almost all of his scenes only have to do with pretty much one thing: how he's going to try and save his own life with the Hex Tech. And I love, and this happens again with multiple characters in the show, that as soon as we've kind of figured that out, as soon as we've kind of, got used to this whole Viktor storyline of, this is just going to happen and he's going to, turn into this, machine man. But then it's like, well, here comes the conflict all of a sudden. Like these characters, as soon as you kind of, they've kind of got rid of their conflict, he gets the leg, he's kind of sorted out, he starts running. It's like Viktor's arc is kind of somewhat been complete. Then it's like, well, here's a massive bombshell for Viktor. Obviously, he kills Skye. He realizes that Skye liked him. He realized he could have had this wonderful life with her, perhaps. And, all of a sudden, again, he's now in massive conflict because now he's just killed someone. Because of, him trying to save himself, and he's now going to have to live with that. And it's so wonderful that, like, this happens to multiple characters in the show where just as, like, everything seems to be sorted out, here's a massive problem with what you're doing. And it's like, the warnings of the past that we see in the show, like, always end up coming true. Heimer's warnings about the dangers of Hextech, that happened, and maybe we're frustrated with Heimer at that point because we want to save Viktor. We're like, no, Viktor needs to live. Well, then Heimer ends up being right. Viktor ends up learning that lesson from Heimer of old, and he ends up killing someone for it. Like, all of these things are just really cool, and Viktor's whole arc is cool, even though it's just a pretty linear story. Moving on to Heimerdinger, and as I say, Heimerdinger, didn't really appear that much in the show, particularly in Act 3. Once he's off the council, that's kind of the end for most of Heimer's story. But as I say, Heimer's sort of pre-warnings to Jayce and Viktor early on, start to manifest themselves, and he acts as a great foil to them early on, because obviously if Heimer isn't there early on, then there's nothing to sort of stop Jayce and Viktor just constantly working on Hextech and kind of going with it. But once he's disposed from the council, obviously he gets the cape, which was just funny to see him sort of walking around with his cape. That just was a joyous thing anyway. But what I liked was, not only is Heimer given that warning to Jayce and Viktor, but then Heimer goes on to sort of discover Jayce's warning to Heimer about, how they've lost touch with what's really going on. And so Heimer goes out and discovers what's really going on. He goes and visits Zorn, and, he kind of goes and understands what life down there is really like. And I love the sort of parallels between that of, on one side, Heimer has warned them and things go wrong. And on the other side, Heimer has to realize that he was wrong as well. And I kind of, just love that, even though it was such a small part of the show, and really, they could have just cut that. They could have easily cut that part out, and, probably not many people would have noticed. But it really actually made a sort of big difference, and I really like it for that reason in and of itself. Now we move on to Ekko, and Ekko, of course, didn't have, like, the biggest role in the show at all. Of course, he didn't show up in the second act, technically. But I liked, a lot of the things that happened with Ekko. Well, I mean, first of all, Ekko is just, like, super cool. Like, the character is super cool, and what he represents is kind of cool. Again, Ekko, again, probably is the closest we can maybe get to a wholly good character, who acts with the best intentions. But I love some of the decisions that they made with Ekko, in particular the Jinx fight scene between Jinx and Ekko. And not just because it was really cool and, the sort of choices that they made were really cool, but the fact that they made that choice to make it this sort of different animation style and make it kind of different to the rest of the show, I thought was a genius idea for a particular reason that, of course, if you play these games, neither of them are going to die from that fight. That they're both going to end up living because, we know that that's not how their story ends. And so, if you do play these games, obviously you're watching that fight and, they could have just made it another common fight scene. But, it's one thing, like, I hate superhero films that have these two superheroes fight that are both going to live because, oh, well, the next film's been announced and they're both in that. So it's like, like, why am I watching? Like, okay, oh wow, a fight with zero tension. But instead of just giving us another fight scene, they gave us, this fight scene where, everything's different. And it kind of keeps us engaged in a different way. Like this new cool art style is being used, to describe this fight. And it was just, again, really, really cool to see how they kind of understood like what's going to be engaging. Like, okay, players of this game know that neither of these characters are really in actual danger of, losing their life. So what should we do instead? Oh, I know. Let's just do something that's completely different to the rest of the show, and that will make it interesting. And it did, and it was cool, and it fit in well, and the whole thing was just, yeah, really, really cool. Moving on to Singed, and again, Singed, doesn't appear a lot in the show, but what I love about Singed is that in this show, again, he could have easily just been, oh, the mad scientist who works for the evil guy. That character is in a million different shows. The mad scientist who works for the evil guy, who, does things that other scientists won't do. Like, we've seen that a million times before, right? That's in a million different shows. But instead of just leaving Singed there and, having that be his character, instead, what do we get? We get a scene between that mad scientist who works for the evil guy and one of the most sympathetic characters in the entire show, Viktor, as a child. Like, we get, this character who perhaps you couldn't care less about, and now all of a sudden we pair them with, perhaps the character that, you feel most bad for and you want the best for in Viktor as a child as well. So, you kind of feel it even stronger that you want, good for child Viktor as well. And you put them together. And it makes sense. And and that's what's beautiful about it, is it all makes sense, and it makes so much sense to Viktor's storyline as a whole, and it works so beautifully. And him coming back at the end saying, like, I understand now, just amazing, just an amazing idea to have those characters. And it's just, again, just another sort of, anytime you wanted to put a character in a box and be like, well, that's what that character is, no, we're ripping apart the box and we're saying this character isn't what you think that they are. That there's multi layers to every character in this show. There's a lot to every character in the show, and again, just beautiful story, right? And now let's go on to perhaps some of the characters who aren't champions in the game. I mean, this one is a champion in the game. But we'll go to Vander, and Vander has, one of the coolest introductions in the entire show when he goes, oh, don't threaten the guy who pours the drinks, and everyone then, is looking at the, like, what a cool intro to the show. And we then find out that he's this, like, super important person, like, very quickly, and, like, just everything, again, really, really great with Vander's introduction. And he, again, even though, again, you might think of this as just like a wholly good character, he's put into difficult, troubled situations where there isn't a right answer. He could have chose a lot of different things, but there is no right answer. And then even when he makes a decision about some things, like he's going to give himself in instead of Vi, at that point, someone else has made a decision that's going to change the story. That his decisions, even once he's made them, other people's decisions also have an impact on that story, whether he wants it to or not. Much like real life, you can make decisions, but if someone else has decided something else, there's nothing else you can do about it sometimes. And that's kind of what happened to Vander, right? Like, he decides to turn himself in, and then all of a sudden, here comes Silco with his monster dude, and, all of a sudden, Vander gets kidnapped, and there's not much he can do about that. So, I love about that, and I love the sort of futility of the show as well, in that sense that, he's troubled with this decision for so long, and he finally makes a decision that he has to give himself in, and, then all of a sudden it doesn't matter anyway because he gets captured, right? Like, it just, how quickly things changed, and the futility of his struggles all that time, to just be captured anyway. And again, just a really cool story writing. And then we come to Mel, and Mel, in Act 1, you probably don't expect much from Mel as a character. She's just part of the council. But then obviously from Mel, this character is amazing, sensational. And what I love about Mel is it's kind of similar to Singed, where, by the end of Act 2, we've kind of figured out Mel. We know what Mel is. She's, this character who wants to pull all the strings. She wants to, control things from the shadows. She wants to manipulate people and, find power through, having all these different threads to pull on, right? So what do? as soon as we've got Mel figured out, what did they decide to do? Well, let's bring in a character that Mel has no influence and no power over whatsoever in her own mother. Just a genius again. And I love the fact that we kind of, have already been given some backstory as well to, like, Mel being banished from her family and all of that. So we already know that there's conflict there. And, just adding in a character that everything that, your character is sort of representing, and none of that matters for this new relationship, is just so cool. And it's just such a cool idea in general that would, be something that could happen. And it just, completely changes Mel. Mel goes from this kind of scheming, like, powerful character to when she's with her mother, she has zero power. And that difference, it makes you view Mel in a different way. All of a sudden, you might become sympathetic to Mel, even though, before you were like, stop manipulating Jayce or whatever. Like, it's just brilliant. It's just absolutely brilliant, the kind of different threads that they keep pulling on. And anytime, as I say, anytime you've got a character in a box, well, here, we're ripping up the box. And they ripped up the box with Mel, and it worked so, so well. Now we come on to Marcus and Grayson. And Marcus, another character that, who would have predicted that Marcus would become such a central character in the show after Act 1? Who was predicting that? I wasn't, but it just shows how, it doesn't take much to sort of introduce a character and make them important in a show and become really interesting, like how quickly they did that, because we pretty much didn't see much of Marcus in Act 1, and again, he was a character that, again, we could have easily put into a box, or the second in command who wants to be the tough guy and, rat out all of the corruption and whatever, like, he's gonna catch him, like, oh yeah, tough guy policeman, like, great, we've seen that a million times as well. But then all of a sudden, Marcus gets thrust into, kind of the center stage. And, I love the difference between Grayson and Vander's kind of deal and Silco and Marcus's kind of deal. And it's kind of almost shown with the last drop as well, where, when Vander's in charge of it and his deal with Grayson, it's kind of this chill, relaxed, pub where people get together and talk. And then when Marcus and Silco's time comes around, it's this throbbing nightclub that, is like this place of craziness and wackiness, and you never know what's going to happen. And I love that. I love that symmetry and that kind of, difference between the two. And Marcus in Act 2 is like in my mind, is the best character in Act 2. He is so interesting in Act 2. And that scene with Silco when he's in his daughter's room and he's threatening his daughter is just an amazing scene. Like, I think that was my favorite scene in the whole of Act 2. And it was just so good at, like, the twists and turns where you become sympathetic to Marcus all of a sudden, even though he's been like this horrible person for most of the show up until that point. You start to become sympathetic towards him, and you start to understand why he's acting the way he does, because, if an evil mob boss was threatening your daughter, would you do what they say? Well, yeah, probably. Like, he does, what you would expect him to do in that situation. And it puts us in conflict as viewers. Like, are we meant to like Marcus? Are we meant to not like Marcus? And we feel this about, like, half the characters in the show. Like, what am I meant to feel about this character? But, Marcus in particular, I think was just really well done in pretty much every single way. He's annoyed with Caitlyn for, being someone he can't control. I'm sure if, you've ever wanted people to do something and they just refuse to do what you say, that you can sympathize with Marcus on such, like, a base level there of just, why won't they just do what I tell them to do? And yeah, it's just a great character in all. We can go to Sevika as well, and again, another character that he was introduced, like, as a main character very late on. And could have just easily been another generic throwaway character, but instead gets, like, her own sort of scenes where she's making deals, and you think, wait, is she actually gonna kill Silco? And the beauty about this show is, like, you think she might kill Silco, like, she could, and it would make sense, and you can start imagining storylines that would happen if she did. Jinx, we know, hates Sevika, so you can imagine if Sevika had killed Silco, that then it's going to be this Jinx revenge on Sevika. And, Vi's had instance with Sevika as well. So maybe there's something there that's going to go on. Like, you can start picturing scenes, like, if she would have killed Silco, what would have happened? And that's what makes it believable, is because up until that point, there have been, like, little breadcrumbs of this could happen. And, so we were constantly just on our heels the whole show about what is going to happen. Of course, it didn't end up happening, but that also is kind of like oh, okay, it didn't happen. okay, here we go. And I'm kind of glad it didn't, because it was just good. But everything, like, Sevika is just a great example of how everything in this show is just kind of like up in the air and you don't really know what's going to happen. And again, just amazing, amazing writing, because there's breadcrumbs for like every possibility in this show. But last and certainly not least, in fact, save the best till last, we come to Silco. And Silco is probably up there with some of the best antagonists I have ever seen in any show. Just amazing. And one thing that I always think is important for any good antagonist in any sort of show is that their motivation has to be understandable and be one that, you can get on board with and you can understand why it's doing. At least in the modern day. Sure, you can go back and like have your Darth Vaders or whatever. But in the modern day, if you want to have a good antagonist, they need to have a believable motivation. And Silco does, to the point where in a different framing, in a different world, Silco would actually be the good guy. You could frame it very much as the guy who, wants to help the underachievers and the poor uprise against, the wealthy elites who look down on them. You could very easily frame that as a good thing, but instead we get Silco as this beautifully written and incredibly entertaining antagonist. And I loved everything about Silco. What I think I love most about Silco, though, is the question, is he the bad guy? It's like constantly coming up. And at different points, you'd probably have very different answers. Because, you maybe start to understand Silco and start to like feel like, okay, as you get, it's like in a horror film, right? Like as soon as you start seeing the evil thing in a horror film enough, like it stops becoming that scary. It stops becoming evil at all, right? And it kind of was the same with Silco. He starts off in Act 1 as like very clearly the bad guy. But then as you kind of see more and more of Silco, you maybe start to like understand and sympathize with him a bit more. But then at different points, at different points, he just like clearly reminded you, oh yeah, this guy is evil. For instance, when, the mob boss's, that woman mob boss's son died to Jayce. And after they just tried to betray Silco, and he says like, oh well, I would have killed your son for this, but that's already been taken care of. Like just things like that, where it's just like, oh yeah, he is evil. But then, at the very end, we get that moment where he's like, I never would have sold you out, Jinx, for anything, and it's just like it hits you again, like, was he that evil? And I love that they ended him with that kind of thing, and with Jinx killing him as well, and it just all fit together so well. Of like just this really complex character where you never really knew what was gonna go on, and towards the end when he's talking to like Vander's statue, and he's like, I understand now, like, what you would do for your daughter. And that I love is like a running theme throughout. Because, of course, in Act 1, it's all about Vander doing anything for his daughters in Powder and Jinx, Powder and Vi, sorry. He would do anything to protect them. In Act 2, it's the same, but this time it's Marcus and his daughter and how he would do anything to protect his daughter from danger. And then in Act 3, it becomes Silco doing anything to protect Jinx as well, and desperate to keep her alive. Like, I love that is like a consistent theme throughout with these different characters and with like characters that you would never expect. And, just how, again, that just shows like the twists and turns. You can see the smile on my face just thinking about like how well done that is, because again, it just all makes so much sense. It just all works so well. And yeah, it was just incredible. Again, that sort of arc that they had throughout the show. But every scene with Silco really is just fantastic. He's like must-watch TV. He's like, you have to just like focus on what's going on when Silco is on the screen. And, in a show like that's full of interesting and unique and conflicted characters, as we just mentioned throughout, he's like starts out as perhaps the most strong-minded and like clear intention of what he wants to do, and that makes him evil. And then he ends up being like very conflicted, midway through it, and then ends up having completely changed his mind and becomes very sympathetic by the end. And I just, I love that. I just love that story writing from start to end. And it's Silco, I think, represents the show best as a whole, where he's just, so muddled and so confused, even though he seemed so in charge and seems so, in control of everything. he's kind of the one that ends up sort of struggling the most with it all, and sort of, not knowing what to do necessarily, and having to, become desperate all of a sudden by the end. And I just thought, brilliant story writing again. And Silco, as I said, one of the best antagonists I've seen in any show. And so that was it. That was my review of Arcane as a whole. Just an amazing show from start to finish, really, with some amazingly well written characters. I'm very interested to see what they will do with season 2, because, as I say, I wouldn't be against them going somewhere completely different and starting a completely different story. If I'm being honest, and obviously we might get both, right? We honestly probably will get both at some point. It might take some time, but I would be surprised if we didn't. But of course, this is just a huge hit, and it's just really well written. And I do hope that they kind of carry it on. Obviously, the production elements you would expect to stay the same. The animation style and all of that. I'm kind of expecting to be the same quality, but we'll have to see if the story writing can keep up with this, because I mean, that was good. That was a really, really good show. But with that said, thank you so much for watching, and have a really nice day.